Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Ellensburg. Hope that you're doing well. Hello, hello. Here's the local time in our little town, 5:46. So if you're watching this in replay form, you can go ahead and skip ahead 14 minutes. We're going to start our lecture on the Grand Coulee at 6 p.m. So glad many of you are with us tonight. We've been at it a while. This is the third in a row. Hope that you enjoy tonight. Hello from Ireland. Hello, Steve Lundblad from Hilo, Hawaii. I've seen that my relatives back in Wisconsin, in addition to my mother, have been watching. So shout out to Sherry and Bob. They're in New Glarus area. Great to have you with us every night. There's another Badger. Australia, happy birthday, Kathy. The Netherlands. Garrett, how are you tonight or this morning? Middle of the night, I guess, huh? Belgium. Many familiar names here. Terrific to see you all. Little reminder for you tonight. I'm not going to see you tomorrow night. I don't know what I will do. Actually, I do know what I'm going to do. So nothing coming to you over the airwaves tomorrow night, Friday night. But here's another reminder that Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, Facebook only, a Facebook page called Learning Geology. You're welcome to join us there. And then Sunday morning, 9 o'clock a.m., back here to our usual YouTube channel, talking about supervolcanoes. How's the audio and video tonight? We had a little trouble last night. If you recall, if you were with us, I had some audio issues where things were popping. I presume things are doing well. The audio is good. Thank you. Great, good, wonderful. Excellent, excellent. I didn't know what 5.5 was. I had to Google what 5.5 was, but I see a bunch of you are doing that. Terrific. Let me get a drink. This came in the mail today. This evening's broadcast brought to you by Cedar Mountain Winery, the Livermore Valley of California. You gotta love it. I got an email a couple days ago from Linda and Earl, who used to live up here in Washington. They're both physicists, worked at Tri-Cities, Hanford, I assume. Started a winery down in the San Francisco Bay Area, just east of it, Livermore, Pleasanton, that sort of thing. And they've been watching our live stream each night. And so they wanted to send up 6 bottles. So thank you for your generosity. I'm not sampling these 2. My wife has already claimed these for her very own self, but I'm gonna grab something else. Just had a pasta dinner. My wife was inspired tonight to make pasta something. I'm from Wisconsin. It's not tuna casserole. Pasta cabanero? No, cabanera? I don't know. So anyway, I assume this is a dessert wine, not a dirt wine. I assume this is a dessert wine, I can't even pronounce that. Again, please forgive me. But I know I'm supposed to do this, right? And then this. Oh, that's delicious. Thank you for the wine. Glad you've been enjoying the programs. Mmm! Our Cedar Mountain Reserves wines are selected from the finest Livermore Valley vineyards. This delicate wine is a nice complement to desserts. Key lime pie, perhaps? And ripe cheeses. You can say that again. Enjoy this gift of our land with fine foods and friendship. Wonderful. It's another beautiful evening here. You know, we were in the mid-70s today. And dead calm at the moment. I had a bunch of breezes a few minutes ago, so you may be able to see I got everything anchored down. I got all sorts of things. I got carried away reading about Brett's this afternoon, so we're going to do a little bit more Brett's. Partly inspired by many of your excellent questions yesterday. A few things that I hadn't thought about at all. So we're going to kind of pick up a little bit of Brett stuff, but there'll be a brand new emphasis tonight, centering on the Grand Coulee, but doing some other things as well. What else have you got to say here? Well, there's a lot of drinkers in this, Dale in particular. I need to restart. Don't do this to me. I'm going to ask you one more time. Are we doing okay with video and audio? I hate to do this every night, but you know we've had some trouble. I'm asking one more time. Are we okay? All good? Jason up there in Wenatchee? Jim, it's great there? Yes, looks good. Sounds okay? Okay. Wonderful. I won't think about it then. Good, okay. I want to set this wine glass somewhere, but I don't want it to blow over. I'll set it next to the house. It's delicious. You guys are so obsessed about the chalkboard. I don't want it to be totally in your frame. I've got it off to the side because I'm doing a lot of hand stuff here. And so you can see a majority of the chalkboard, so I feel like that's where I want it. And I want a little bit of blue sky. And I'm always kind of cut off here, but you know, I've had my share of experience talking into cameras, and I've learned over the years that, you know, presenters that are back here and they're talking and they're doing all their stuff, it's not as immediate. So even though I'm lopped off, that's good. You don't want to see this anyway. And I want to come right into your living room here. There's a certain connection there. I could almost whisper this one tonight. I don't hear any neighbors. The wasps are out already. It seems early for that. We didn't really have a hard winter. That's Liz's idea, but anyway, I got to get the screens on the house. We got all the windows open, and we'll have a party for flies and wasps in there. Yes, I'm talking very. Can you hear me right now? This is a test. Ice Age floods tonight. If you take 10 and then you subtract 3, what are you left with? Hey. Can you you still hear me? This is fun. We got 3 minutes before we begin. We're up to 335 people, 341 people. Boy, those 6 people came in a hurry. Yes, if you're new to us, I don't say this every night because I don't want to be repetitive for the regulars, but I'll be speaking for about a half an hour. I'll try to keep the energy up and I'll try to keep things moving along as I try to do here. And then when it's time for question time from you, we will have a live Q&A session. And that's when I would ask you kindly to use your uppercase for your questions only so that I can easily read them, and I try to get to as many of those as I can. And I know many of you say, I need a mod. I guess that means moderator. Nah, it's just me. I like just doing things myself. Easier that way. So a few of you have even offered to be a mod, but thank you, but no, doing my own thing. Two minutes. Let me get my thoughts together here, and we'll get started. Gotta get my wine. Well, it's the top of the hour. We're beginning our program this evening. Thank you for joining us. So glad that you've been joining us for all of these, whether it's live or watching them in replay after the fact. Seems like both is true for many of you. We've got a lot of audience participating and wanting to leave comments and interact, and others that it's more convenient to watch after the fact, and that's great too. It's fun to present these to you all, and it seems like it's going well on your end as well. So let's jump into tonight's topic, which has a close relation to our discussion last night. I'm going to refer to last night a fair amount, so if you haven't seen the J. Harlan Brett's program yet, and I guess if you're watching it in replay form right now, why not go and watch the J. Harlan Brett's thing first, and then watch this one? But you can do what you like, I guess. You're in control there in your house. I wish I was in control here, but anyway. So I'm going to refer to J. Harlan Brett's especially early tonight to get us into what the plan is tonight. My main plan tonight is to give you our most current view of ages of individual floods and where those floods traveled. So we have made some significant progress since the 1970s, when Brett's was spending his last decade with us in his 90s at that point. And there was kind of this baton that was passed to this next generation of Ice Age floods geologists: Vic Baker, Richard Waite, Jim O'Connor, Bruce Bjornstad, a number of others that I'm sure I'm forgetting right now, and they'll be offended if they see this, but oh well. So there has been some great work, and even in the last 5 to 10 years, by just a handful of people, we have some exciting new dates for those floods going in particular places in eastern Washington. So that's where I want to land with you tonight. At 6:30 or whatever, at 6 o'clock now, in a half an hour's time, I'm hoping to get to that precision with you. But to get there, I think we need to revisit a little bit of where we were last night with Brett's. I actually want to go back just a touch tonight before Brett's. I did some reading this afternoon underneath that tree and really enjoyed it, so I want to share that with you. And then we'll expand a little bit on some details with the Grand Coulee itself. So, okay, that sound like a plan? Sound like you wanted kind of what you wanted? Well, first of all, where are we talking about with Brett's work? The answer is Eastern Washington. This is J. Harlan Brett's last major publication in 1956. And these are the colors that he chose. And you can certainly notice all these channels in green going across eastern Washington. And even in 1956, as we discussed last night, nobody believed him. In 1956, I mean, he's in his mid-70s now, and he's still publishing this stuff with an audience that's essentially deaf to what he's trying to say. And by 1956, the Columbia Irrigation Project was in full bore, and the Grand Coulee Dam was pumping the water, and we'll talk a little bit about that irrigation project. Okay, so we kind of finished there, mainly with a little coda at the end of last night's discussion saying that Brett's was finally accepted before he passed away, which was a nice story to finish on. But where can we go specifically to see the Grand Coulee? So the glare is maybe there, but maybe not. We're going to use this board a little bit more tonight. So here, this is mostly what we had last night, if you recall. You know, the Cascade Mountains, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens. That's not part of our story tonight. Here's my backyard in Ellensburg, Washington. I've got the same 4 little towns on this map tonight that I did last night. Vantage, Washington, right next to the Columbia River. Chelan, Washington, right next to the Columbia River. Spokane, Washington, quite a ways away from the Columbia River. And Washtuckna, which is a dinky little town as you drive toward a Washington State Cougar football team, game. This is the ice sheet. This is the ice dam. I don't know if you can see that or not. So you had a good point there about you can't see the whole board. So we made a comment last night that Brett's, for most of his career, did all this amazing work to document that there had to be catastrophic floods of water across eastern Washington. But during his prime of a geology time, he did not have a source for the water. And in that last publication in 1956, he finally, in print, talked about Joseph Pardee's water in Glacial Lake, Missoula, and made the connection. But not until that last publication. So we're going to have our ice dam fail occasionally, and we're going to have some water spilling over. And I'm going to be using this chalkboard a fair amount when we get to the timing of this. These specific dates that I want to give you about what we know about specific flood paths. Okay? Grand Coulee itself is about in here like this. And that's the star of the show tonight, the Grand Coulee. And it's just like it sounds. It's a big valley, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But there's another big valley that's parallel to it. So Grand Coulee here, and this coulee is called Moses Coulee. And it doesn't have a major road going up it. It has a road, but it doesn't get much traffic. It's a very unique place in Washington, and we're going to talk about Moses Coulee a little bit. And again, we're going to be talking about this pathway of the Columbia River. So this is the Columbia. For those that are not in Western North America, the Columbia is coming out of the Rockies in Canada. The Columbia River is coming down through here, making this swing. The Columbia River is eventually going right through the Cascade Mountain Range and going to the Pacific Ocean. And all of our Ice Age floodwater, whether it's Missoula floodwater or Ice Age floodwater coming across the border directly from British Columbia, we can talk about that if you like, all that water has to go through Wallula Gap, the eastern entrance to the Columbia River Gorge. Okay, would you be willing to go back a little bit before Brett's time. So last night we mentioned that Brett's, primarily in the 1920s, was here every summer in the heat of summer with graduate students walking around for the most part. Eventually he had a car. He owned his first car in 1925, and they drove out from Chicago as opposed to taking the train. That was a big trip. And he left the wife and kids over at Bainbridge, I think, and then came back out and worked with the grad students. So they had automobile transport in the last half of the 1920s. But we're going to the Grand Coulee with Brett's eventually, but let's go to the Grand Coulee initially. So a bunch of geologists have written papers on the Grand Coulee itself. Yes, that involves dry falls. Yes, that involves Steamboat Rock. This is Grand Coulee we're talking about. Yes, that's the place where today it's called Banks Lake. So the earliest written account by white folks in the Grand Coulee is 1835. Reverend Samuel Parker's describing his early thoughts. 1835, a couple of decades before the Civil War. And Samuel says, well, this Grand Coulee is indubitably the former channel of the Columbia River. And that was the main message that Brett spent most of his career fighting. The idea that the Grand Coulee was simply a former channel of the Columbia River. It was just a Columbia River process that cut that canyon. More coming on that in just a bit. If we go ahead to 1882, Army Lieutenant T.W. Simons had some amazing quotes. Brett's actually quoted him the best. So I shared this book with you last night. This is from Brett's in 1932. I'll come to this a fair amount tonight. The Grand Coulee, really his last major publication in those years that he was coming every summer. And Brett's quotes Simons in 1882. This is Lieutenant Simons. We went north through the Grand Coulee, its perpendicular walls forming a vista, like some grand old ruined roofless hall, down which we traveled hour after hour. Its spectacular scenery has often been remarked by travelers since then. The Grand Coulee is forming a vista like some grand old roofless, ruined hall. Pretty good stuff. My point is, a lot of geologists have been thinking about the Grand Coulee many decades before Brett showed up. Including I.C. Russell, who was briefly in the story last night. I.C. Russell was a USGS geologist who was out here in the Northwest, and he visited with Brett back in Michigan when Brett was a high school teacher. And I.C. Russell was in the Grand Coulee in 1893, and I.C. Russell said, I've looked at the Grand Coulee. I think there was a river flowing through the upper Grand Coulee heading to the north. And a few other geologists in the late 19th century thought that there was some sort of old river flowing from south to north through the upper Grand Coulee. And then the ice age and an ice sheet then pushed that river and had it go the other way. But they were still thinking river or swollen river of the Columbia coming through there. Finally, 1905, Calkins, a geologist, was the first to talk about some sort of structural geology there, that the German chocolate cake, the flood basalt layers were flat on one side of the Grand Coulee, and then they kind of warped down, what we call a monocline, just warps and layers, and then the layers flattened out again, and he saw a connection between where that monocline warping of the bedrock and the trace of the Grand Coulee. He didn't think that was an accident. I gotta share this with you too. I'm getting too carried away, but this is the Grand Coulee. You tuned in for a Grand Coulee program, didn't you? I think you did. In 1912, there was a whole conference of geographers from around the world. 1912. And they showed up and visited the Grand Coulee. This is a decade before J. Harlan Brett's ever visited the Grand Coulee. So I found this. I don't know who gave this to me. I'm not going to read it all to you, but it's a photocopy of the Coulee City newspaper, September 13th, 1912. Distinguished geographers Representatives of foreign universities come here, says the writer in Coulee City, which is right in the middle of Grand Coulee, by the way. Come here to study the geographical conditions, declare scenery wonderful, say indications point to a large lake in Coulee and at some prehistoric time. They're talking about the party. I'll give you that just a little bit. An American Geographical Society of New York with some 45 European members and 30 American professors on its transcontinental excursion visited this region Wednesday on the direction of Dr. William Morris Davis of Harvard University. The party included distinguished professors from Australia, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and Switzerland. They go on to say they had a beautiful lunch at George Baldwin's place at the base of Steamboat Rock. They had some great watermelon at A.L. Tucker's place, also in the Upper Grand Coulee. This is the floor of the Upper Grand Coulee, which now is under the water that has been pumped out of the Columbia River to form Banks Lake for the irrigation project. I'm speaking quickly now, mostly because I'm very excited. Where's this quote? It's a sexist quote, and I have to find it. Yes, speeches were made by the Harvard professor Davis, who complimented the owners of the place and said that this audience was especially interesting because of the presence of so many good-looking ladies. Adding that the most remarkable part of it was, as he understood it, everything here in the Grand Coulee was only 3 years old. I guess this guy's from Harvard saying, well, I guess y'all must have shown up in the last 3 years, so that's pretty remarkable, because we got a lot of good-looking people here. Needless to say, several cracked a smile at this remark. Count Kontelica of Budapest, Hungary, also spoke in a jocular vein, as did F.L. Farnsworth, who came with the party from Wilbur. When we finally get to the geology part of this newspaper article, the last paragraph, the Grand Coulee lake bed, referring to the probable solution of the origin of phenomenon of the Grand Coulee, the consensus of this group, if not unanimous opinion of these scientists, is that it presents every evidence of having been a lake or a river bottom at some prehistoric period, though the immediate cause of its transformation was probably due to a volcanic eruption or earthquake. This, they are particular to say, is only an opinion. So they had no idea what they were looking at. But the idea of a swollen Columbia River persisted for a solid century. In many of the dry falls plaques, this is an old waterfall at Dry Falls. We'll talk about it in a second. And the Columbia River is just, got a little bit more water in it, and this is coming down the Grand Coulee, and it's cutting the Grand Coulee. Bretz eventually says, I have so much evidence, if you would just take the time to read this frickin' evidence, that there's no possible way that's just a regular river coming down the Grand Coulee and carving this thing. And we'll go through that evidence in just a bit. Thanks for playing along with me. Since I'm with this thing now, So let me show you a couple other things. I gave you a sneak peek in this. This is 1932. This is at the end of a solid decade of work by Bretz, not only in the Grand Coulee, but in Moses Coulee, in the Drumheller channels, over at the Palouse Falls area, down by Wallula Gap, down back in the Columbia River Gorge, Bretz and his students, year after year, up in British Columbia looking for volcanic vents that may have melted a bunch of ice to produce the source of the water. Remember, at this time, he didn't know where the water came from. I earmarked a few places. I can't hold it. So here's the first paragraph when Bretz is introducing his readers to the Grand Coulee. Grand Coulee is a canyon 50 miles long, nearly 1,000 feet wide, and about a mile in minimum width. It is now streamless. Trending nearly north-south, it crosses the highest portion of the Columbia Plateau in Washington, an interfluve area 1,500 feet above the Columbia River to the north, which is itself entrenched at the Coulee head along the plateau's northern margin. Its grim black walls of basalt frown across the Coulee broken chain of linear lakes, some of them as wide as a Coulee floor. Again, I have to interject. You know, there's a bunch of lakes we have today that are a direct result of the Columbia Irrigation Project. The lakes Brett's is describing in 1932 is a couple of decades before they're pumping that water out of the Columbia. So he's looking at natural lakes that are a result of the Ice Age flooding digging, the erosive power, those colks and those deep pits. Here are potholes 100 feet deep in rock, dry cataracts. Cataracts are old waterfall basins, 100 to 400 feet high, and river bars, which are the flood gravels, 100 to 200 feet thick. Yet many of the lakes are ephemeral or alkaline. The cataracts are merely dry cliffs, and the river bars are hills on the most abandoned great stream bed. Permanent streams have almost completely disappeared from the region. Glacial ice caused the drainage detour across the divide and the making of this great trench. On the reopening of the old drainage ways, temporarily occupied by ice, the Coulee became dry, and under the present semi-arid climate, it lies naked of forest mantle, every detail of its form clearly displayed. All right, so let's look at this one. If I can get this to focus properly for you. This is a wonderful map from Brett's. He's got his channeled scabland. Is this focusing well enough? He's got Glacial Lake Missoula over here in 1932, but he's making no attempt to connect this water with the source of his floods. Again, as we mentioned last night, he had the ice sheet right down to Spokane over the Rathdrum Prairie, and we now know that's where the water was surging from the outbreak. So he has the ice dam, he has Glacial Lake Missoula, but he either was unaware or refused to take Pardee's advice to make that work. A couple other things from this diagram. So as I mentioned last night, he's got all sorts of aerial photographs. This is of the Dry Falls area itself. And then he's got these annotated diagrams that he's drafting by hand, I assume, in his office back in the University of Chicago. Here he's talking in 1932 about this proposed irrigation project and how he has seen the plans of putting in a dam made out of concrete that's going to block the Columbia River just like the ice sheet did back in the Ice Age time. And his main point is, it makes sense. You've got this huge Grand Coulee, which is just waiting to get filled like a swimming pool with water you can divert out of the Columbia River, and then you can go ahead and irrigate all these places that desperately need the water. So he was very interested in this proposed idea. I'll finish since I'm here. Here's a beautiful, I didn't show you this last night. So here's his 1932 map of the Grand Coulee area, Steamboat Rock. I mean, it's amazing this guy didn't have any converts. I'm almost of the belief nobody even bothered to read this guy. It's all there in black and white. All you need is a semi-open mind. Here's how he concludes with the last paragraph. In 1932, basically, and we're going to get off of Brett's, but basically, he's like, look, I've written for 10 years. I've got 8 major papers. It's all here. I can't do any more. You're not going to believe me. You're not even going to read my stuff or visit this place. So let me finish this, and I'll move on to other stuff. He went on to research caves and other kinds of systems in other parts of the country. Grand Coulee asks of the visitor, this is Brett's writing in 1932, Grand Coulee asks of the visitor no sacrifice of his time or comfort. It is crossed by Yellowstone Trail, that's the old road, at Coulee City, and automobile roads lead directly to almost every feature described herein. A few of its unparalleled characters require an additional hour or more of walking and climbing. It provides an adequate reward for anyone except the man to whom a cliff is but a cliff, and all canyons are alike. Brett's is pissed. And for him who is in love with nature, holds communion with her visible forms, the majestic Coulee tells a heroic tale of vanished power and glory far transcending that of Niagara, and beggaring the leisurely story of the Yellowstone, the Yosemite, or even the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. The end, says Bretz. And he only had to wait 50 more years for people to embrace him. Wow. Okay. Can't remember who sent me this. It showed up in the mail and I appreciate it. This is 1947. Written by Fred Jones. Grand Coulee, From Hell to Breakfast. A story of the Columbia River from molten lavas and ice to the Grand Coulee Dam. So Fred was the chief geologist for the National Hydroelectric Engineering Bureau. My main point is there's no mention of Brett's in 1947. Brett's doesn't exist. All that work, not mentioned at all. But I don't want to slam this guy too much because there's beautiful illustrations here. So here he's got the German chocolate cake, the basalts, the flood basalts. He's got kind of north going like this. I don't know if you can get oriented. But here's the cutting of the upper Grand Coulee and Fred's story, which is everybody's story at the time. The ice sheet showed up. I'm going to do it on the board in just a second. The ice sheet crept down over the Waterville Plateau and diverted the Columbia River. Case closed. That's it. Grand Coulee, simple. River. Even though there's no river today. Look at these cartoons of the granite that is older than the German chocolate cake. And then 1947, this is great. We're bringing in the basalt lava flows, the flood basalts. We're burying the old landscape. I wish I had this a couple of years ago. I would have used it. It's beautifully done. More of them. There's some leaf beds at Grand Coulee itself and Coulee Dam, those towns. Here's that monocline where we're actually folding the layers. So Fred is right on the mark in 1947 with all of the geology except for the person who shall not be named, J. Harlan Bretz. He's got a glacial lake. So when we bring the Okanagan lobe in, as we'll do on the board in just a second, we're going to back up a bunch of water and make Glacial Lake Columbia sitting in the where Roosevelt Dam is today, or Roosevelt Reservoir is today. Here he's got retreating waterfalls coming down the Grand Coulee, but he's doing it with just a swollen river. I'm getting carried away now, but here he's got the ice. So there's much of this that's right on the mark. Even today, we've got a beautiful illustration showing all the lakes that we know in the lower Grand Coulee. All right, I feel like I want to do one more thing with this kind of chronology, and then I promise we'll go to the pure geology and get you up to speed. Bates McKee, textbook, 1970. Is he going to talk about Brett's? Page 283. This Bates McKee is at the University of Washington. Remember, that's the place that Brett's left, half a century earlier. The Brett's Floods, 1970. It's about time. The mechanism J. Harlan Bretz proposed for the cutting of Grand Coulee and the many dry scabland channels to the east was erosion by gigantic floods of water. The theory was inspired by evidence from many parts of the plateau. This consisted mostly of features that are found along rivers today, but of such large dimensions as to demand the passage of unimaginable volumes of water. The evidence included stream boulders weighing many tons scattered wildly across the plateau, especially at channel mouths. The theory was not well received when Bretz first outlined it almost 50 years ago. He's writing in 1970. The region was not well known at the time. Soon, however, other geologists came to look for themselves. For the most part, they discounted the Brett's floods. They proposed more complicated but less catastrophist theories that relied heavily on normal runoff augmented by meltwater from the ice cap to the north. None of these geologists spent as much time studying the evidence as did Brett's. Way to go, Bates! Brett's was unable to explain the origin of his floods, however, and the geologic profession was, for the most part, unwilling to accept his theory. By the way, the main consulting geologist for this thing in 1947, Richard Foster Flint, the arch nemesis of J. Harlan Brett. Okay, let's flash forward to today. It's 6:30 already. I definitely got carried away there, but I hope you enjoyed it. Let me use the chalkboard and a couple of key things from some field trip guides to bring you up to speed on, now that we know we had multiple floods and we definitely had gigantic floods of water, what do we know currently about pathways? All right. So what we need to do, I'm going to give you three numbers. 18,000 years ago, 16,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago. Okay, so nice round numbers. There's some error, etc., but let's just use those three, 18, 16, 14. Now we have evidence of some Ice Age floods now that are more than 800,000 years old, but we know so little about them that I'm not going to address them now. I'm going to focus just on the retreat of the most recent Ice Age and talk about the ice sheet itself. So what was the first of the three numbers? Patrick, Evelyn? Correct. 18,000 years ago. All right, 18,000 years ago, we don't have the ice sheet. It's up here in the roof. The Okanagan lobe of the ice sheet, surprisingly, is not on this map 18,000 years ago. But we do have this Purcell ice lobe blocking a bunch of water in Montana, and we have a big old glacial Lake Missoula. So let's have an Ice Age flood. Let's have a Missoula flood 18,000 years ago, and it's a big one. And let's have this water come into Washington. A majority of that water, this major Missoula flood, is going to find its way to the Columbia River Valley 18,000 years ago, and it's going to follow the river. It's water. It's just going to follow the path of least resistance. It's not going to come down the Grand Coulee because we don't think the Grand Coulee existed yet. It's not going to come down Moses Coulee because we're not sure the Moses Coulee existed yet. This is the most simple version of the story. And so this massive Ice Age flood, the Missoula flood 18,000 years ago, gets into the Columbia, cruises right past Chelan, right past Wenatchee, right past Vantage, right through Wallula Gap, and out it goes. At Wenatchee, we know from careful measurements of the flood gravels, all of East Wenatchee sit on 600 feet of river rock that is now interpreted as rock that was brought in there quickly during this Missoula flood and dumped into that area of Wenatchee, Washington. The depth of the water at Wenatchee, this massive Ice Age flood 18,000 years ago, 1,100 feet deep, moving a minimum of 40 miles an hour down the Columbia. So there's ways since Brett's time to do math, to take the width and the depth of each pathway and calculate the volume of water and calculate the speed of the water based on the depth of the deposits, to calculate the depth of the water by finding ice rafted erratics up high. And if you're like, how do you know 18,000? That doesn't sound right. How could you possibly? It's just water. The water's gone. How can you say that water came down 18,000 years ago? Well, do you remember our ice rafted erratics? Those icebergs were floating in that flood, and those icebergs, broken up from this Purcell ice dam, were carrying rocks with them, and the rocks were rafted on the hillsides 1,100 feet above the Columbia River, and they were left there 18,000 years ago. And you're like, how do you know that? And the answer is we have a way now to take measurements to basically sample the outer shell of the boulder that was dropped by the Ice Age flood by an iceberg, measure the amount of radioactive decay in certain minerals, and figure out how many years cosmic rays have bombarded the surface of that boulder. And you're like, that sounds pretty shaky to me. Well, that cosmogenic exposure dating technique has been used on dozens of boulders now, and those cosmogenic dates are agreeing in general with our older school approaches that we're talking about in just a second. Okay, what was the first of the three numbers? 18,000. Let me show you. So here's a map that I made for a field trip we did last June. And this is the 18,000-year-old flood. And where are we here? Everything's outlined in red, so everything's between the red lines was under this 18,000-year-old flood. And a bunch of the rocks were dropped here in East Wenatchee because the floods were confined, and then this broad area of Wenatchee opened up, so a lot of the water backed up all the way to Leavenworth, and a bunch of the water sloshed up against the base of Saddle Rock, etc. There's erratics there. And they basically came around that curve. And then any place that we've got so much water, remember there's more than 1,000 feet of water coming down the main stem. Any place we've got a side canyon that's open, we got water ponding up in that area. So there's some of that water creeping up. This is Moses Coulee, and this is Crater Coulee, I guess. Lynch, Crater, I can never keep those straight. Okay, 18,000 years. What was the next number? 16,000. Well, I got a question mark date between 18,000 and 16,000. It's 17,000. So here, and Moses Coulee is the most challenging of all of the areas. So it's on purpose that I'm not talking much about Moses because we don't know much. What we do know for sure, the only thing we're sure about, is that 5 major floods came down Moses Coulee. And there was so much water coming down Moses Coulee that we had flood water dumping into the mouth of Moses Coulee and going both up the river and down the river. And by the way, this is at a time when we have the Okanagan lobe getting set up. So let me pause for just a second. So by 17,000 years ago, between 18,000 and 17,000 years ago, our Okanagan ice sheet has crept into the picture, has started to divert some of the water of the Columbia River, and so the Columbia River is finding its way into Moses Coulee and carving Moses Coulee. Now, my telling you this, I have all sorts of question marks, and we all do. How's it possible to get that water in there? Are we sure there were 5? Yes, we're sure there are 5. Are we sure it's 17,000? No. There's probably a much more complex history with Moses Coulee, but nobody has it yet. But my point is, now that we realize that this area where the Okanagan lobe is coming in, this area is where we have 5 major floods coming down Moses Coulee, picking up a bunch of rock and dumping those rocks and damming the Columbia at this time. Well, who did that work? That's Richard Waite back in the 1970s. He carefully looked at the deposits in these flood bars at the mouth of Moses Coulee, and he found 5 gravel beds, and in the gravel beds, everything was basalt. So he knew that the floods had to come down Moses Coulee instead of coming down the Columbia, because there's not basalt coming down the Columbia. Remember our German chocolate cake? It ends right here. So if you've got Ice Age floods coming down the Columbia like you did here, you're going to be bringing crystalline rocks. You're going to be bringing salt and pepper and even white rocks. But if you're a Moses Coulee Ice Age flood, Missoula flood water, but it's getting into Moses Coulee, you're dropping nothing but chocolate chips and Tootsie Rolls and pieces of the German chocolate cake. I'm going to continue. I don't know how you're feeling now. You're watching in Belgium and you're like, I don't even know where Washington is. What the hell? What are we doing here? I'm sorry, I'm pretty local, I'm pretty site specific, but I hope, especially those around the world, I hope you can see the techniques involved and some of the data we have to say something like we definitely have more than one flood now. And based on cosmogenic and finding volcanic ash layers that are above a certain slack water sediment but below another one, we can tease out the timing of this. Patrick, Evelyn, what was the next date? Sweating. 16,000 years ago, correct. Good job. So 16,000 years ago, we have dozens of floods. And I'm choosing green here. Now, what am I showing? I'm showing mostly water coming from this area, spilling into the Columbia, and there's so much water coming from this area, I'm being coy for a reason, that it's dumping into the Columbia and it's backing up. Look at it. That's all quiet water, chocolate brown colored water that's filling this area. This is called the Quincy Basin. And guess where that water got? Guess how the flood water got from Montana to the Quincy Basin before the Quincy Basin overspilled into the Columbia? That's right. The answer is the Grand Coulee. So let me show you what I'm hoping to do. I'm running late, but this is the juicy part of the lecture. I hope you feel it's the juicy part. Let's look at the other whiteboard. He goes to the other whiteboard. I didn't even show you the first whiteboard. This is from last night. I was going to talk about more of Bretz's evidence about crossing divides and things, but I'm getting rid of that. Okay, let me give you a second to kind of get your bearings. We talked about one major flood sticking to the Columbia Valley, 5 floods at least coming down the Moses Coulee, not sure when, possibly 17,000. We're now here and talking about dozens of floods coming down the Grand Coulee, forming the Grand Coulee, retreating a waterfall that's now at Dry Falls but was originally at Soap Lake. We talked about that in Livestream number 3 if you want to go back and watch that one. And these last 2 guys are small compared to these other ones. So let's slow down and talk about 16,000 years ago. Blue marker. You like how I give myself commands? Talk louder. Move the chalkboard. All right, have you figured out what this is? I've got Wenatchee and Vantage. I have a town called Coulee City where we read the newspaper account where all the good-looking women are apparently. This is the Columbia River. So it's already gone, but I had the Columbia River 18,000 years ago, and we had our major flood coming down there. Quiz time. Which of these coulees had a bunch of water in it 17,000 years ago, question mark? Correct, Moses Coulee. So why would the water leave Columbia River Valley, and why would the next 5 Missoula floods decide to go into Moses Coulee? We know the answer. The creeping ice sheet is pushing south. So suddenly, this part right here, there is no Columbia River, 17,000 years ago, there is no Columbia River at Chelan or Wenatchee because the ice sheet is blocking the Columbia, and the Columbia is being sent down this way. In between Ice Age floods, but during major Ice Age floods, where we burst the ice dam, we're going to have a big old Ice Age flood coming down Moses Coulee 5 times. Now we're to 16,000 years ago. How are we going to get water into the Grand Coulee? That's right. We're only going to get Missoula floodwater into the Grand Coulee if we have the Okanagan lobe getting as big as it's going to get. Put that in your mind if it hasn't been there before. This is not a swollen Columbia River story. This is an Ice Age flood story. We have 400 feet of water barreling down the Grand Coulee. with each massive Ice Age flood coming from Montana. And it's coming down over Dry Falls, or it's coming down over other places in the Grand Coulee and carving Grand Coulee when this Okanagan lobe is at maximum size. So if we follow that water down Grand Coulee, that's a retreating waterfall system that we talked about last week. When the water finally gets into Quincy Basin, which is a broad open basin even today where there's a lot of agriculture, Moses Lake, the town of Moses Lake sits right in the middle of it, we're going to spread that water out. So I always teach of Quincy Basin like a clawfoot bathtub. It's just a basin or a little kiddie pool, a swimming pool, and it's just waiting for it to fill up. And if you still have the water running in your clawfoot bathtub or your swimming pool, you're going to have water spill over the rim. And there are 4 distinct places in Quincy Basin where the water actively spilled over the rim, the basalt ridge that surrounds Quincy Basin. And a key piece of evidence for Brett's was that all 4 of these spill points were at exactly the same elevation. Now, if you just want a swollen Columbia River, can you please explain to me, says Brett's, why we have water spilling over these 4 places simultaneously at exactly the same elevation? It's impossible to do that with a swollen river. So if you're curious, this is Frenchman Coulee, this is Potholes Coulee, this is the Gorge Amphitheater where everybody's smoking pot, this is Drumheller Channels. And at times there were all 4 of these outlets active at the same time. And it's this water dumping into the Columbia that not only is draining south, here's the Quincy Basin. The water's spilling over Potholes Coulee, Crater Coulee, Lynch Coulee, whatever. And here's this bath water that's creeping up way almost to Chelan. And the evidence for that are slack water sediments. So if you have quiet, dirty brown water and the water sits there for a couple of weeks, the silt that's in that chocolate milk or that dirty brown water is going to fall out. And when the water finally passively drains away, you're left with a record. You're left with a deposit called a slack water sediment layer. Most famous down south near Wallula Gap. I got to finish the story and then I promise we're going to your questions. Good Lord, this is a record. I'll just do the last couple semi-verbally. The last significant Ice Age flood, Brett's didn't know any of this, right? Brett's didn't have any of this timing figured out. He had no way to date these floods. He just knew he had a lot of water. He didn't have just a river, but he had no inkling of the timing of any of this. We're eventually going to break up the Okanagan lobe and we're going to restore the Columbia River. And that breakup of the Okanagan ice sheet is going to drain Glacial Lake Columbia for the last time. And because the Grand Coulee has been completely cut, and because the Columbia River Valley is lower, as Brett's mentioned, than the floor of Grand Coulee, that water is just going to come right back down over Wenatchee one last time. So here's this 14,000-year-old flood in orange, confined to the Columbia River, just like the one 18,000 years. But this was a lower flood. I've got elevations here, but we won't waste our time. And it's these last 2 relatively small floods that left these impressive giant current ripples that you may have seen programs on. A place called West Bar, which is in the county where I live, Kittitas County. So the massive giant current ripples are from that breakup of the Okanagan lobe. 14,000. This is Daniel Coe again, by the way, from the Washington Geological Survey. And then the very last flood that Richard Waite has, not other people, one last flood 13,300 years ago. We definitely have Native Americans living in the area at that time. Okay, give me 4 more minutes, would you please? Back in the 1980s, the beginning of this kind of sharing geology among the residents of the Northwest began in earnest, not just in geology circles. And this book, some of you probably have it, Cataclysms on the Columbia by Allen, Burns, and Sargent, told this story of Brett's and his nemesis, Flint, and put it all together for people. And again, before the mid-1980s, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have ways to learn about this. And so this amazing story of Ice Age floods and the Missoula Floods was just not known outside of our little cliquish scientific community. Here's a second edition of the same book. This is from the Roadside Geology guys over in Montana, Glacial Lake, Missoula. But these two books are, in my opinion, the best. They are written by Bruce Bjornstad, a geologist who still lives in the Tri-Cities. He's a friend of mine. And he not only is telling this story on the trail of the Ice Age floods, book 1 and book 2, with his former advisor at Eastern Washington University, Gene Keever. There's not only the story, but Bruce has spent the time on the ground, kind of like Brett's did, and he quotes Brett's a lot. But he's got specific places to drive, specific places to hike. It's not a storytale book or a storytelling book. It's a very specific guidebook that's way better than just a roadside thing, in my opinion, although the roadside geology books are helpful to a certain degree. Woo! That's a record, 6:48. I'd love to answer some of your questions. 600 people, terrific. Thank you for your patience. Let me click over to live chat. Let me scroll back. We got neighbors talking to each other loudly on the sidewalk. I will concentrate the best I can. What explains all the coulees east of Grand Coulee? Great question. The key is understand, do I have it? Yep. So this is from the Ice Age Floods Institute, a beautiful map. Here's the source of many of the Ice Age floods in Montana. Here's Grand Coulee, where we were mostly tonight, right here. Look at how weird Moses Coulee is, coming out from underneath the ice. And there's where that 18,000 and 14,000 year flood came down. So the dark gray areas are where we had Ice Age floods. The question is, why do we have all this stuff out here? These aren't really major coulees. They're just scablands, meaning that the loess is gone, the overlying silt is gone, the soil is gone, but these are not nearly the deep canyons that the Grand Coulee and the Moses Coulee are. But I take the spirit of your question. The answer is, each time you have a Missoula flood, you're draining this glacial Lake Missoula in about 48 hours, we think. That was Brett's thought as well. And you break through the ice dam and you take all that water and you dump it into Glacial Lake Columbia. And Glacial Lake Columbia is there 16,000 years ago because this is in the way. So these guys are from basically putting too much water in Glacial Lake Columbia's bathtub and having the water spill and flood. There were some floods that were just hauling blank straight down to Pasco, the Cheney-Palouse track, but still no major coulees here compared to the major coulees, Grand and Moses. I got papers flying everywhere, but I don't care. You're more important. Why did the Okanagan lobe reach its maximum 2,000 years after the glacial maximum? Washington in general had ice that was delayed. There kind of is a round number of 18,000 years ago as a worldwide glacial maximum. It's called the last glacial maximum, the LGM. The Puget Lobe on the Seattle side that Brett's was working on, and this ice sheet over here was in delay. I don't know if anybody's really nailed it, seems like our latitude and our position with the ocean and the source of the ice coming in British Columbia is somehow different. That was a crappy answer. Basically, we don't know. I should have just said we don't know. Were there any Ice Age floods on the Salmon River? I apologize for the digression. Well, it's an Ice Age flood, Eric. There was one major Ice Age flood called the Bonneville Flood that came down the Snake River. And there were constrictions in Hell's Canyon that held some of that water up, just like some of the water coming down the Columbia. So there probably was a little bit of slack water. I like that term because it means it's quiet water that's kind of creeping up a neighboring valley, but probably no more than a few miles. I don't really know. Are any of the books free? No, but there's a free website called hugefloods.com, which is a tremendous resource put together by Tom Foster. hugefloods.com. 1,100 feet of water piling up. Any evidence of earthquake-caused landslides? Well, there's something called the Malaga landslide, which is just south of Wenatchee. And many geologists, not all, think that that major Ice Age flood may have undercut that area and triggered the landslide. It's tough to prove that. There's another big landslide called the Corfu landslide. God dang it. Sorry. So there's a case to be made that some landslides are triggered by a big Ice Age flood coming along the lower part of the ridge and undercutting it. But I wouldn't say it's a common thing. What was the timing of the last flood in the Grand Coulee? That's a tough one. This is from Ryan Carlson, who works for state parks and does a lot of the interpretive signs of state parks all across the state. He's a great asset to what we're trying to do here. I'm just picking 16,000. We don't have the precise dates we need, number one. And we're forming Grand Coulee by having a waterfall retreat. Oh, that's what I wanted to show you. Let me finish my answer and then I'll show you. So the timing of how many floods are we talking? All I said was dozens. Is each Ice Age flood separated by 100 years? Let's say we have 20 floods and it's 100 years between floods. Well, now we're in a 2,000-year time window. Is the ice sheet really in that position for all that time? We're in the neighborhood of 16,000 years, Carlson family, but I don't know if we can say more than that. I want to try this, if nothing else, just to see if it works. My dad had a phrase called, "Let's all get in the cozy fort." It's not as creepy as it sounds. We made an animation. Have you seen it? Whoop, there goes the clock. Timex. You gotta love it. Still have some glare. I need a darker blanket. This is not gonna work. Ah, I love you so much. Oh God, I'm almost gonna give up on this. Play. Shit, forget it. This place is a desert, and yet it's the premier spot to learn about the Ice Age floods. The Missoula Floods. And yet it's the premier spot. Hold it. The Ice Age floods. Stop. Hold it. Stop. Stop. I'm wasting your precious time, but we made an animation. It cost $8,000. I want to show it to you. Years ago, there was a waterfall here, but not like the waterfall that you have in your mind, perhaps. Here on the lip of Dry Falls, there was more than 350 feet of water moving 65 miles an hour over this cliff. This is water from a bursting ice dam 170 miles away in Idaho that ripped through central Washington. Oh, damn.
A wall of water
Oh,
that
damn!
dwarfed the local landscape with the energy of 10 times the power of all the world's rivers combined. An ice age flood with water, rock, soil, and icebergs 3.5 miles wide on a thundering journey to the Pacific Ocean.
You gotta love it. The fact that this lava rock is so full of vertical and horizontal. So you know what we were doing. We were trying to convey what Brett's was building a case for a century ago. And in that ability, with those magical effects by the animators, maybe got people away from thinking about a Niagara River going over that cliff. And I've heard from a lot of people who say, hey, you made that? You told them how to make that? You exaggerated. That's BS. And I'm like, sir, we were actually conservative with that. At the cliff in the Grand Canyon at Dry Falls, it's a 400-foot high cliff of lava rock, and a guy named J. Harlan Bretz proved that there was 400 feet of water coming over that 400-foot high cliff. And the guy says, yeah, but still. All right. I'm running long, but I was screwing around with a whole bunch of stuff, so I'm going to go long with you here tonight if you're willing. If not, you can click off. Is the move Ice Age an accurate depiction of an Ice Age flood? Oh, is the movie Ice Age? I haven't seen the movie Ice Age. I'm embarrassed to say that. I don't have children that age. I'm sorry. Let's go with no. So the western lobe advanced and retreated once during 18,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago? Yeah. And there's been a lot of data in the last 20 years to pretty much make that clear. The maximum size was 16,000 years ago, 18,000 on the way there, 14,000 we're breaking it up. But that's pretty well established. But it's a fine question to say, well, maybe there were some Ice Age floods in the Grand Coulee in the next oldest advance, like 120,000 years ago. And we got no evidence for it, but I don't know if you have to do all this carving just in the last 20,000 years. What about Omak Lake? I don't know much. I'm just starting to get serious about learning in the Okanagan. The Omak Lake appears to be a glacial story, an ice sheet story. But if you talk to my BC friends, British Columbia friends, who want a bunch of Ice Age floodwater coming from underneath the Okanagan lobe, it may be the result of highly pressurized water shooting out from underneath the ice sheet and carving the basin that Omak Lake sits in. There aren't any mountains to the south of Glacial Lake Columbia, so why did the water just drain away? Why didn't the water just drain away? There aren't any mountains to the south. It's an elevation game, Susan, so if you've got too much water in your basin and you've got the rim of the bathtub at various elevations, you got a couple low spots, you know what's going to happen. Your floor is going to get wet. If I only have 1 week to make a geology trip of Washington, what do you suggest? I guess you'd want to pick a couple of your favorite topics, because Washington is Disneyland for geologists. So if it was an Ice Age floods thing, Grand Coulee, I can make a list. Grand Coulee, Moses Coulee, giant current ripples at West Bar, Palouse River Canyon, where Palouse Falls is located, Drumheller Channels, Wallula Gap, Columbia River Gorge, giant current ripples on the floor of Glacial Lake Missoula at Camas Prairie. There you go. What's the difference between coulees and scablands? Isn't it just a depth? Is it just depth of carving? Pretty much. I would say you have scabland if you remove the soil, but you don't dig into the bedrock basalt. And you get a coulee if you remove the soil and you start hauling away a bunch of the basalt bedrock. but both are from Ice Age flooding. Thank you for these questions. And you're doing a great job with uppercase for questions only tonight. Thank you. What is the reason for the folding of the monocline in the Coulee? Next week, I think we're going to talk about the Yakima Fold Belt and Seattle Fault. And even that monocline up there is related. So wait till next week. Are the Missoula floods happening during the summer? We have no way to have that amount of precision. The closest we can get to figuring out seasons is looking at these tiny things called varves. Have you heard about them? You can find some layers of mud that go dark band, light band, dark band, light band, and we're sure that the dark bands are winter and the light bands are summer. And Brian Atwater, who's famous for his great earthquake stuff, actually did work in Glacial Lake, Columbia in the early 1980s before he did his earthquake stuff, and he found a bunch of varves between Missoula flood deposits. So he was counting years between floods. So I don't know, maybe he did find a varve that was a summer and then here's a big flood. Never thought of that. But generally, no, we don't have that precision. Bonneville flood is taking the Lake Bonneville, which was a big lake during the Ice Age that sat where Great Salt Lake is today, and it drained quickly north over Red Rock Pass and into the Snake. Was the Columbia running down the Grand Coulee between floods? I think that's a fair way to say it. So we're subtle now, aren't we? If you go to Dry Falls and listen to the interpreters in 1955, they're saying, look at this old waterfall. Fine. This is where the Columbia River used to go over this cliff. Fine, if we're talking about times between Missoula floods. Because the Okanagan lobe is in place, and if there's water coming down the Grand Coulee, it's kind of a Columbia River looking thing. In fact, this is a decent map showing the path of the Columbia River when the Okanagan lobe is in place and we're between Ice Age floods. We got the Columbia dribbling over Dry Falls. We got the Columbia going through Moses Lake. We got the Columbia coming through Drumheller channels. We got the Columbia River during this time when the Okanagan lobe is in place, flowing along the north face of Saddle Mountains before it joins up with what we know as the Columbia Path today. And you're like, well, how is that possible? Well, the Okanagan's in place. If the Okanagan, I'm yelling now, if the Okanagan lobe is diverting Missoula floodwater, it's certainly diverting the Columbia River. So yeah, I think that's what you'd want to view. So what's the subtlety? The Grand Coulee was not carved just by the river, and that's what Brett was trying to convince people of. Where is John Stockton? I'm a huge fan. I know where he lives. That's embarrassing to say. Did an earthquake possibly break up the ice dam? I guess it's possible, but there's no evidence for that, and it seems more likely that we just had enough water in Glacial Lake Columbia to finally weaken the ice. The ice is starting to retreat anyway. It's a warming time at the end of that 16,000 year time, but can't rule it out. How do we know how thick the topsoil was prior to the floods? So, as we talked about last night, we have a lot of places where these areas of eastern Washington were completely missed by the floods. Completely missed. That area, that area, that area, that area, totally untouched. And so we have a certain thickness of the soil, and the soil is older than the floods. So it's just an extrapolation game. Let's see if I can find one of my favorite photographs to go along with that. These are these field guides that you're welcome to go find at nickzentner.com if you like. Click on the Ellensburg chapter of the Ice Age Floods window and you'll get to these. You can even download them. Oh, really? Yep. So to look at these islands of soil that got missed by the floods, you do need to go over to the eastern part of Washington. So here's Ritzville up there along I-90, and here's a famous place. So now we're out here. We're north of Washtuckna now, a place we haven't really talked about tonight. And so you can see each of these. This is what Bretz was out there mapping with his students. They were putting these on maps and going, well, this is all brown because the soil was washed away. That's scablands. Here's a bunch of lakes to prove that the water is digging into the bedrock a little bit. But then each of these islands looks like this from a drone or up in a hot air balloon or whatever. And you can even see that look at how steep it is around the margins there. So if you were really against Bretz, you'd say, well, I don't know, I guess that soil was just plopped on there like after the lava rock. Well, how do you just plop it on there without having a very gradual transition? Why is it such a steep thing? And why do a lot of these islands kind of are streamlined like this and they have tails? I mean, it goes on and on. So that we can kind of connect the dots between those isolated spots. I'm having a good time. I'm not going to see you tomorrow night, so I'm going to go a few more minutes. You're a loyal person if you're still with us. I'll go until the sun, well, no, that might take a while. What about a meteor strike on the ice sheet? So, I love that geology is so inclusive now, and it's not just a few experts and then everybody else who doesn't know anything. So that's a really good thing. And we can access all these scientific papers and we can visit all these places easily, and you couldn't 100 years ago. But I do have a bit of a problem. If you just have an idea, I'm not scolding you now, but I know what you're relaying a message which is quite popular these days. I feel like it's not the way to go to just propose the idea and state it as fact and not have the years of field work to back it up. It's backwards to me. Bretz went out and compiled all this data and then came up with this idea of a big flood. And it feels like now there's a growing community of people who love geology, love to think about all this stuff. That's wonderful. Feels like they're locking into one idea that they want to be true and not honestly going through all the data. That's not the way to approach things scientifically, in my view. Not trying to make enemies, just trying to give you my own view. And we have so much data now involving not only the floods, but the timing of some of the floods, that to just have something strike the ice sheet someplace else and have all the water come through here once doesn't fit the data that's here. Thank you for your question. Right, another one about Younger Dryas. I've tried my best to learn about the Younger Dryas, and I need to learn more. But from what I've heard and read so far, it doesn't match up with at least what's here in the Pacific Northwest. And that's all that I do. I focus on the Pacific Northwest. So if there's compelling evidence in Greenland or somewhere else, I don't know anything about that. And I don't pretend to know anything about it. It's calm, the wind has gone away. How long until the evidence erodes away? Well, Eric, I'll take the spirit of your question. This is relatively fresh stuff. You know what? That's how we'll finish. This is how we'll finish, where we started. Back to Brett's one last time. This is his last publication in 1956. And just before we started, I read this and thought, I should share this. Yeah, I'm going to read it to you. Page 56 of J. Harlan Brett's Washington's Channeled Scablands, published bulletin number 45, State of Washington, Division of Mines and Geology. The date on this is April 15th, 1959. I think this was published a few years after Brett's wrote it, but anyway. Settle in. I'm going to lose the sun by the time I'm done with this, but I want to read you this page. It perfectly summarizes Brett's work and his challenge for future workers. Let me get the wine for this. It's just you and me. There's nobody else here. We're all around the campfire. Think of those nights that Brett's had with his students out there. Conclusion. This is his last big paper. Nowhere in the world is there known or suspected a story at all comparable to what we read from the Scabland forms. Evidence of the magnitude of the floods has been, and may continue to be, questioned simply because the flood theory goes far beyond any other geological explanations for past, unwitnessed events in Earth history. Geologists, like most humans, tend to think in accepted patterns. The Colorado River's Grand Canyon took millennia to excavate. Why not use more time with less water to get comparable results in the Scabland? Try that concept of moderately proportioned rivers working through a protracted time to make possible 1. Quincy Basin's 4 contemporaneous outlets, 2. Drumheller's and Dry Falls' widths, 3. He's getting pissed. Rock basins like Scoutney Lake, 4. Bars, flood bars like Cold Creek, Upper Crab Creek, and Shoulder, 5. Giant current ripples, 6. Plucking and transportation of the boulders of Othello channels, 7. Backfilling, as in Yakima, Walla Walla, and Snake Valleys, 8. Divide top scabland like that south of Hooper and Washtenaw, 9. Wallula Gap's 800 vertical feet of scabland, and 10. The anastomosing drainage pattern over an area of 15,000 frickin' square miles. It's 1956. This guy is pushing 80, and nobody is still listening to him. His last 2 paragraphs. There's only one reasonable conclusion. Enormous volume alone could have been responsible. Enormous volume alone could have been responsible. If the computed discharge rate through Wallula Gap is approximately correct, Lake Missoula would have been emptied in about 2 weeks, not 2 days. He said 2 weeks. Although known glacially dammed lakes have had later been drained under observation by failure of their dams, no lake as large as Missoula has stood so high above and so near the country swept by the escaping water. No other glacial lake has been so deep against its dam. No such lake has had a dam so favorably situated for a catastrophic quarrying out by tremendous hydrostatic pressure. No second dam, like the Okanagan lobe, has diverted those waters from a major drainage lineament capable, like the Columbia around the Big Bend, of keeping floods of any conceivable magnitude within its valley walls. No area like the broad, loess-covered, basaltic Columbia Plateau has been so favorably situated for receiving and keeping the flood records. We do not yet date the successive glacial floods, but the freshness of the channeled Scablands records indicates a geological recency. They await your inspection in their almost pristine forms. I say good day, sir. Thanks for joining us tonight. Here's to you and your health and all your loved ones and everyone around you in whatever community you have, whether it's in the prison of your single room, in an apartment in a high-rise somewhere, or in a place where you can get out and at least breathe some fresh air for apparently the next few weeks. We're taking it day by day, and we will all be able to get back out to places like the Grand Coulee sometime soon. Here's to you. Amen. I love you. Good night.